Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
So if you're a college student just diving into forensic psychology for the first time, welcome. Today, we are doing a deep dive into a really fascinating, honestly kind of tense topic.
Oh, definitely tense. We're looking at Chapter 16 today, which is all about evaluating and assisting jury competence in civil cases.
Right. And to set the stage for you, let's go back to 1997. Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote this really blunt opinion where she said juries have the ability to profoundly disappoint us.
She really did not hold back. But, she wasn't the first to feel that way.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I mean, back in 1872, Mark Twain was actually complaining that the jury system, and this is a quote, puts a premium upon ignorance, stupidity, and perjury.
Wow. Tell us how you really feel, Mark Twain.
Seriously, but it just shows this deep, persistent anxiety we have about handing over incredibly complex legal decisions to, 12 totally random people.
Yeah, and the media absolutely feeds into this fear, right? You're constantly bombarded with these wild headlines about massive, chaotic civil verdicts.
Exactly, like the $2.7 million verdict against McDonald's for spilled hot coffee. Or that $5 billion in punitive damages against Exxon after the Valdez oil spill.
Or Apple winning $1 billion over Samsung.
Yep.
I mean, the narrative we get fed is that the civil jury system is it's totally off the rails, like this rogue institution making wild decisions.
But our mission today is to look past those sensational headlines. We're going to dig into the actual empirical research in forensic psychology. How do everyday people solve these legal puzzles, and why do courts sometimes block the exact tools that could help them?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the purpose of this deep dive is to scientifically evaluate if the civil jury is truly out of control, and to explore the psychological procedures designed to fix it.
Right. So to start, we have to look at the friction at the very heart of a civil trial. The jury is asked to calculate two very different types of damages.
Yeah, so first you have compensatory damages. These are designed to make the injured party whole, right? So covering medical bills, lost wages, that sort of thing.
Okay, and then you have punitive damages, which exist purely to punish egregious conduct and deter it from happening again.
Precisely. And critics, especially those in the corporate sector, argue that this dual role completely overwhelms jurors. They claim juries just get swept up in the emotion of the case.
Right, like they ignore the actual math and just hand out these massive punitive damages because they want to punish unpopular defendants. It's what they call a litigation crisis.
Yeah, but here's the thing. When you look at the empirical data from forensic psychologists, it tells a totally different story.
It really does. I mean, punitive damages are actually infrequently sought by plaintiffs in the first place. And when they are sought, they're rarely awarded.
Exactly. And even when they are awarded, they're usually pretty modest. The runaway jury handing out billions of dollars is mostly a theft.
And even with those rare, massive, headline-grabbing verdicts, the money is almost never collected in full. Judges routinely slash those amounts post-trial.
Right. But despite the data, the legal system has still responded as if this myth were completely true. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly stepped in to impose boundaries.
Like in BMW v. Gore and State Farm v. Campbell, the court basically said, look, the jury system isn't unconstitutional, but there have to be strict limits.
Yeah, the Exxon shipping case is actually the perfect example of that intervention.
Oh, right. The jury awarded $2.5 billion in punitive damages for the Valdez spill, and the Supreme Court just slashed it down to $500 million.
Yep. They explicitly established a 1-to-1 ratio between punitive and compensatory damages in maritime law. And we're seeing similar stuff at the state level, too.
Yeah, state legislatures are pushing these aggressive tort reforms, limiting joint and several liability or putting hard caps on non-economic damages like pain and suffering.
And elevating the standard of proof, too. In a lot of jurisdictions, you can't just win punitive damages with a preponderance of the evidence anymore. You need clear and convincing evidence.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I'm seeing a huge contradiction here. On one hand, the data shows juries aren't actually running wild.
Right.
But on the other hand, the Supreme Court is imposing strict 1-to-1 ratios, and states are passing all these tort reforms to rein them in. If they're intervening this aggressively, aren't they basically admitting the critics are right?
I mean, it looks that way on the surface, but the intervention is actually targeting a totally different problem. The system isn't fundamentally broken or rogue.
So what are they reacting to then?
Unpredictability. The data shows that juries do a genuinely good job matching their verdicts to the evidence overall, but they really struggle with specific cognitive tasks.
Like what? What kind of tasks?
Well, for instance, two different juries might award vastly different dollar amounts for the exact same injury. They also have a measurable tendency to overcompensate plaintiffs with minor losses.
And then they drastically undercompensate plaintiffs who suffer really catastrophic, life-altering losses. So the issue isn't malice, it's just human cognition hitting a wall.
Exactly. If we want to understand this unpredictability, we have to look at the psychological theories of how jurors actually process evidence. They aren't just absorbing facts like a hard drive.
Right, they're not calculators. Which brings us to the story model, right? This is the leading framework in forensic psychology for this.
Yes, the story model. Jurors don't just objectively weigh each piece of testimony and assign it a mathematical value. Human brains just aren't wired that way.
So instead, they actively construct a narrative. They take all the disjointed evidence and mentally weave it into a coherent story that makes sense to them.
Right, and if a piece of evidence doesn't fit the narrative they've constructed, like, say, a forensic accounting report that contradicts their view of a greedy CEO, they don't revise their whole worldview.
They just discard it or minimize it because it breaks their story. That is so human.
It really is. And once they have their story, they just look at the legal verdicts available and pick the one that fits their narrative best. It's highly subjective.
That explains how they get to liability. But translating that into a specific dollar amount seems even harder. This ties into the goal manager's theory, doesn't it?
It does. Jurors aren't just trying to solve one single problem. They're trying to satisfy multiple competing goals all at once.
Oh, right. They want to compensate the victim, punish the wrongdoer, and send a message to society, all at the same time.
Think about the massive cognitive load that requires. You're asking lay people to keep 3 or 4 abstract mental tabs open while processing weeks of dense legal testimony.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. So because it's so taxing, they inevitably fall back on mental shortcuts or heuristics.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful heuristics is anchoring and adjustment. A juror will anchor onto an initial value that they hear.
Like the specific dollar amount the plaintiff's attorney requests in the opening statement.
Yep. Or even a number they saw in a news headline before the trial. And once that anchor is set, they just adjust up or down from that number.
So that anchor exerts this huge gravitational pull on the final verdict, even if the initial number was completely arbitrary.
Exactly. Kahneman actually did a fascinating study on this in 1998. He asked mock jurors to rate their level of outrage regarding a defendant's reckless conduct.
And he found incredible consistency there, right? Like human beings broadly agree on what constitutes bad behavior and what makes us angry.
Yes. But when he asked those same jurors to translate that exact level of outrage into a specific dollar amount for punitive damages, the consistency completely vanished.
The numbers were just all over the map, which really highlights a fundamental flaw in what the law expects from a jury.
Right. Evolution equipped us to feel outrage and socially punish bad actors. It did not equip us with an internal dictionary that translates anger into a financial metric.
We just don't have a mental algorithm that says, level 7 outrage equals exactly $50,000. And then on top of that, you have hindsight bias.
Oh, hindsight bias is huge. The law explicitly requires jurors to judge a defendant's actions, ex ante meaning, based only on what the defendant knew before the incident.
Right. Were they acting reasonably given the information they had at the time? But the jurors are sitting in a courtroom judging the conduct ex post after the disaster already happened.
It's nearly impossible to cognitively unknow the outcome. Once you know a bridge collapsed, your brain automatically alters your perception of the events leading up to it.
So hindsight bias is like watching a horror movie and yelling at the character not to go in the basement. It seems so obvious to us because we already know a monster is down there.
That is the perfect analogy. We are judging their decision with information they simply don't possess at the time.
And psychological research proves this. Once a juror knows a bad outcome occurred, they automatically view the prior conduct as less reasonable.
Exactly. And they perceive the resulting harm as having been much more predictable than it actually was.
Okay, I want to pivot a little and go back to the friction between compensatory and punitive damages. Specifically, how outcome severity affects the math.
Sure. So legally, compensatory damages scale linearly with the actual injury. A broken neck means higher medical bills than a broken finger.
Right. So the award is higher. But punitive damages operate on a totally different logic. They're designed to punish and deter.
And this is where the legal standard demands a massive psychological pivot. Punitive damages shouldn't just scale with the harm that did happen, they scale with the potential harm.
The Supreme Court highlighted this in the TXO case, right? With that hypothetical about the guy firing a gun into a crowded room.
Yes. So imagine a man wildly fires a gun into a crowd, but by sheer luck, he misses everyone and just breaks a $10 pair of glasses on a table.
The actual physical harm is tiny, so the compensatory damages are just $10 to replace the glasses.
Right. But if the justice system only fines him $10, that provides zero deterrence against him doing it again tomorrow.
So the punitive damages can be massive because the jury is punishing the reckless behavior and the catastrophic potential harm he risked, not just the $10 reality.
Exactly. Which brings us to the defendant's wealth.
Yeah.
Because if deterrence is the goal, the punishment has to actually sting.
Right. Fining an average person 10 grand is devastating. Fining a multi-billion-dollar corporation 10 grand is, well, it's a rounding error. It deters nothing.
So does the jury get to look at the defendant's bank account?
Yeah.
This is highly contested. But empirical data debunks a major corporate fear here. The deep pockets bias.
That's the fear that juries will award higher compensatory damages just because a corporation is rich.
Yes, and research shows that's largely a myth. Jurors generally understand that a defendant's wealth doesn't change the actual cost of treating a broken leg.
But for punitive damages, the law actually dictates that wealth should be a factor, because a $1 million fine to a giant corporation is just the cost of doing business.
Exactly. The penalty must be proportionate to their wealth to achieve genuine deterrence.
So we've seen how groups struggle with these cognitive tasks. The obvious question is, what if we just change the people making the decision, like during jury selection?
Attorneys spend so much time analyzing demographics, age, gender, income, trying to filter out the wrong jurors. But the science shows that doesn't really work.
Right, basic demographics are terrible predictors of how a juror will vote. What actually matters are attitudes and schemas.
Yes, a schema is essentially a mental framework that helps a person organize and interpret information.
So, for example, if a juror holds a schema that society is plagued by a litigation crisis full of frivolous lawsuits, that acts as a filter.
Exactly. So when they see a plaintiff crying on the stand, their schema filters that emotion not as genuine suffering, but as a manipulative performance for a payout.
The evidence is identical, but the schema radically alters the interpretation. And studies show jurors with that schema give consistently lower awards.
It's how they fundamentally view the world that determines the verdict, not their tax bracket.
Well, if finding truly neutral jurors is basically impossible, why even bother with juries? Justice Stephen Breyer famously suggested judges might just be better at this.
It's an old debate. You're probably thinking of the landmark 1966 Calvin and Zeisel study comparing judges and juries.
Yes. That study is a cornerstone of forensic psychology. They analyzed over 4,000 civil cases, right?
They did. They had the presiding judge write down how they would have ruled and compared it to the jury's verdict. They agreed on liability 78% of the time.
Okay, I really struggle with the logic here. If lay people and highly educated judges agree almost 80% of the time, why assemble a jury at all?
Right. Why not just save weeks of time and let the judge do it?
Exactly.
Well, what's fascinating here is that replacing the jury with the judge doesn't actually solve the cognitive problems. Judges are susceptible to the exact same cognitive biases as lay jurors.
Wait, really? Judges fall prey to hindsight bias too?
Absolutely. And they rely on the same heuristics. More importantly, judges suffer from severe cognitive blind spots when it comes to inadmissible evidence.
Oh, because if a judge rules a document is excluded, they still had to read it to make that ruling.
Exactly. And research shows judges cannot effectively compartmentalize that knowledge. They cannot cognitively unring the bell. That excluded info subtly influences them, just like a juror.
So shifting power to the bench isn't a magic fix, which means we have to optimize the juries we already have. We need courtroom procedures that act as cognitive aids.
Yes, but this is where the legal system gets very stubborn. Many courts actively fight against these psychological tools.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at something as basic as letting jurors ask questions during the trial. Some courts hate it.
They really do. Historically, the system wants jurors to be passive sponges. The Second Circuit in U.S. v. Ajmal strongly condemned juror questions.
Because they're afraid that if a juror asks a question, they become an active advocate, like joining the prosecution's team.
Right. But when psychologists study this in real courtrooms, that fear completely falls apart.
Like the Hoyer and Penrod research. They showed that jurors ask an average of, 5 questions per civil trial?
Yep. And they aren't combative, gotcha questions. They're almost exclusively appropriate, fact-clarifying questions that help them understand dense testimony.
But what if a juror asks a question that violates the rules of evidence and the judge refuses to answer? Won't the jury feel slighted and retaliate?
Diamond's research looked at that exact scenario, and it turns out the fear is overblown. Jurors don't mutiny. They accept the judge's ruling and calmly move on.
It's like courts are terrified of jurors taking any initiative. And that extends to note-taking. For a long time, the common law banned jurors from taking notes.
It's wild, considering trials can last for months.
If I sit in a 1-hour meeting without a notepad, I retain nothing. Why on earth was this banned?
It's rooted in historical anxiety. Back when literacy was rare, courts feared that a single literate juror would take notes and totally dominate the illiterate jurors in deliberations.
That old fear is fascinating. It's like worrying that the one kid in a college group project who actually knows how to use a spreadsheet is going to become a dictator.
Just because they have the data organized.
Yeah.
That is exactly the dynamic they feared. And even modern courts still resist it, worrying about a distorted, rogue record.
But the psychological data dismantles that fear too, doesn't it?
Completely. Research shows note-taking acts as a profound cognitive aid at the encoding stage. Writing it down forces the brain to encode the information more deeply.
And it helps them distinguish between plaintiffs with different injury levels, right?
Yes, and it absolutely does not result in the note-taker dominating the room. They average about 0.6 pages of notes per hour, so it's very efficient.
Such a simple tool. But some states are trying even more advanced interventions to fix these cognitive flaws, like pre-deliberation discussions.
Right. Traditionally, jurors cannot talk to anyone about the case, not even each other, until the trial is over and the door is locked.
But Arizona's Rule 39 changed that. It allows civil jurors to discuss the case during breaks as long as all jurors are present.
Which sounded dangerous to critics. They thought it would lead to premature verdicts. But Hannaford and Diamond studied these Arizona juries, and the results were incredibly positive.
It acted as a cognitive release valve, right? It significantly improved their recall of complex evidence.
Yes. And because they could talk to each other, it reduced the temptation to talk to their spouses at home. And there was zero evidence of premature verdicts.
Wow. What about giving them direct access to the actual trial transcripts?
Horowitz and Forsterly found that giving jurors transcripts fundamentally changes how they process the case. It forces systematic processing.
So it decreases their reliance on those biased heuristics we talked about, like anchoring?
Exactly. Their recognition memory of the intricate details just skyrockets.
Let's look at one more major intervention: written summaries of expert witness testimony. This seems vital for really complex cases like toxic torts.
Forsterly tested giving jurors a written summary of an expert's technical testimony before the expert actually took the stand.
So it's exactly like a professor handing you a syllabus or a study guide before a dense lecture. It gives your brain a schema to organize the complicated information.
Spot on. It provides a pre-built organizational framework. The research confirms this massively improves long-term memory retention and information processing.
Though I did read it might slightly increase damage awards for the most severely injured plaintiffs.
It might, yes. But overall, the positive impact on the jury's cognitive functioning is undeniable.
So what does this all mean? If we step back, the media wants us to believe the civil jury is an inherently broken, rogue institution.
But the empirical reality is that it's a highly orderly system. It generally does a very good job.
And the unpredictability we do see isn't from malice. It stems from the very real cognitive limitations of the human brain, the struggle to translate emotional outrage into a dollar amount.
But those flaws can be dramatically mitigated through psychological interventions, like note-taking, questioning, and pretrial summaries.
Exactly. So next time you prep for a forensic psychology exam or even get called for jury duty yourself, you'll know that the system isn't just relying on blind guesswork. There is a deep science to how a jury evaluates truth and how the courts can assist them.
This raises an important question, though. If these simple cognitive aids dramatically improve a jury's performance, what does it say about our legal system that so many courts still fiercely resist letting jurors use them? Are we more attached to courtroom tradition than to actual justice?
A perfect provocative thought to leave you with. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for tuning in, and best of luck on your forensic psychology studies.